Chapter 5. Wilks tapped on Leslie's door, using the small bottle of whiskey he'd bought. "Hold on a sec!" He heard muffled footsteps coming towards him, and then a loud thump. "Shit!" Wilks smiled. The door opened to a very red-faced Leslie rubbing her right knee. Behind her was an overturned chair. "Wilks, you asshole!" she said, straightening up. She wore a snug black bodysuit and a matching headband. Sweat dotted her tawny skin. In spite of her words, she grinned. "That for me?" She motioned at the bottle. "Well, if you're busy." "That depends." "I wanted to thank you for helping us out. Thought we might have a drink, unless you're otherwise involved." Leslie grinned wider and stepped back from the door. "You always were the subtle type," she said, and her voice softened slightly. "Come in, David." Billie sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair and watched the vidscreen flicker with the ruins of Earth. The scanner roamed, and it surprised her how much old data was still being broadcast. Mostly advertising for companies long dead, sometimes documentaries, the occasional fiction program. Many were in different languages. Billie touched the command button from time to time, looking for something real, something current, something like Amy. There was a flash of static and then a blank screen. Suddenly, a man's face appeared, a close-up. Middle-aged, he was handsome in a rugged way, sharp nose and strong jaw, dominated by intense dark eyes. His mouth was tightly set, deep lines etching the corners. He stared into the camera, as if he were about to fight it, his gaze unwavering. Something about the bland determination on his face reminded Billie of... "This is an exercise of faith," he said, "of the new Christ and the power she commands." His voice was deep and compelling. Spears, she thought. Like spears. The camera pulled back to show the man standing on a low platform in a poorly lit studio. He was tall and short-haired and wore a tight coverall that emphasized his biceps and chest. A large knife was strapped to one hip. "I am Carter Dane," he said, "and I have seen the truth." Billie heard quiet murmurs of approval from off-screen. "There is power in my hands. The goddess has shown me the way." He began to pace back and forth as he spoke. "The goddess brings no fear. The goddess has no fear. We are her children, she our mother. We are not worthy of her. It is the failing of humanity." More mumbles of assent. Dane continued, his voice rising. "When the cleansing began, I was afraid. I cried in self-pity and fear. Afraid for my own life and the lives of the weak and unworthy all around me." He paused for dramatic effect. "I was no more than a pile of shit," he said. "Yes!" A hoarse cry from the unseen audience. "Useless and impotent fear," he continued, "left me empty. Incapable of action, I wallowed in it. I was crippled by it." He stopped moving, faced the listeners. "And she spoke to me. She asked for my help. The goddess, the creator of so much power, asking a cripple to aid her. Like she asks of all her chosen. and I became strong. For her, I learned of her love. I found that death is shit. It is fear. It is nothing. Billie sat, transfixed, watching the screen. She found herself unable to move, to hit the command button. Another of the dreamers, and completely insane. Dane motioned to one side, and a heavy-set woman in ill-fitting soldier's gear dragged a young man onto the stage. His hands were tied behind him, and his slow, stumbling movements suggested heavy sedation. The soldier pushed him to the floor next to Dane and stepped back into the shadows. The boy looked barely out of his teens, was thin and dressed in rags and dirt. He lay on his side, eyes closed. Dane pointed at the prisoner, but kept his gaze on the listeners. "This," he said with disgust, "is humanity. Weak, afraid. He is not fit to be the giver of divine life, not when so many of the willing stand strong and proud in front of me." Dane made a sweeping gesture towards the crowd and put his hand on his hip, put his hand on the hilt of his knife. He pulled it out slowly and held it up. "The old humanity has outlived its usefulness," he said. He knelt beside the boy. The youth gave no sign of having heard the speech and did not struggle as Dane pushed the blade, without apparent effort, deep into the bound boy's throat. Blood erupted out across the platform. The boy opened his eyes and his mouth as if to speak. A horrible wet gurgle was all that came out, a look of confused pain on his pale face. He rolled onto his back, his eyes fluttering. More blood spewed from the wound to mat his dark hair and white skin. His thin body shuddered in one final spasm. His eyes remained open. Dane ran the back of the knife across his forehead, smearing red across his brow. Swiftly, he ran the point of the blade from the groin to the sternum of the dead youth, cutting deeply. He turned to face his listeners, a wild grin on his face. "Come and feed!" he shouted. "Eat of the flesh, devour the old, become one with the goddess!" He dropped the knife to the floor, then thrust one bloodied hand into the boy's gut, then lifted it to his own mouth. Dark figures stepped onto the stage, tattered men and women converging on the corpse, a dozen or more, faces crazed, laughing loudly, reaching, pulling. Dane ranted on, his mouth dripping blood, his voice cracking. "We are the chosen! We will become! We will—" Billie hit the command button convulsively, breaking the trance. The screen went to static, and dimly, as if from another place, she heard a commercial for a retirement complex begin. She shivered all over. She stood, knocked over her chair. She ran blindly away from the madness, her hand over her mouth. There was a waste bin in the corner of the room. She stumbled to it and vomited, retched again and again. Slowly, her surroundings came back into focus. Her spasms subsided into hitching, ragged breaths. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Okay." She brushed at her watering eyes. The dreams had been too much for their minds to bear, on top of watching their world crumble, their families killed. But not her. They were sick, demented. She was here, and would change things. "Okay," she said again, and straightened up. The smell of vomit was overpowering and sour, and she stepped away from the bin. She felt a sudden fury at what the Queen had done, her and her goddamn calling, urging those people into madness, giving the unbalanced a reason to kill. Billie sniffed and wiped her mouth with the back of one shaky hand, then took a deep breath. The boy's dying face would come back to her later, she knew. There was nothing she could do to change that. For now, she would concentrate on what she could change. Wilks gently cupped his hand over one of Leslie's soft, small breasts. She stretched leisurely and covered his hand with her own, smiling. They lay nude in a tangle of sweaty sheets, the musk of recent sex in the air. Wilks propped himself on one elbow beside her. He felt relaxed and at peace with his body. Leslie was a good lover, confident in her abilities without being assuming. She said, and opened her eyes to look at him. Not bad, Sarge. You should be promoted. Wilks smiled. Yeah, I think I make a pretty good drill sergeant. Drill, drill, drill. Leslie made a face. On the other hand, your jokes leave something to be desired, like humor. What? Hey, I'm funny. Shit. They lay still for a moment, preoccupied with their own thoughts. Wilks remembered his conversation with Bako. The evidence of the Mother Queen's existence was not overwhelming in his own mind, so proving it to somebody who didn't know Billie, specifically to the General, would take a lot more than what they had. When are you leaving, David? The dream alien. You're going to wherever she is, to get her. It was a statement, not a question. I don't know, he said. There's still a question of how. Official backing is iffy. He shook his head. We're not even sure of where she is yet. Ask me when I know more. And you're going with nothing more solid than a psychic vision. Less. I don't even dream the dream. But you do. Do you believe it? Yeah, I think she's real. She nuzzled her head against his bare chest. I'll do whatever I can to help. Wilks stroked the palm of his hand across her smooth belly in small circles, then moved lower, lightly touching the edge of her pubic mound. Yeah? Anything? She pushed up against him, eyes closed. His penis stirred, pressed against her leg. She rolled towards him, a sly smile raising a corner of her parted lips. You are pretty good as a drill sergeant, she said. Now, which is for shooting and which is for fun? Alone in her quarters, Ripley shut down the computer and rolled her head forward, yawning. Her thoughts had started running into each other. It was late, and the pills she had swallowed for an earlier headache didn't seem to be working. Stronger medication would require a prescription, and her intrinsic mistrust of medtechs. She frowned. How had that come about, anyway? Must have happened after the long sleep, some incident in the hospital that had lodged in her subconscious. She couldn't recall caring either way before that. It really didn't matter. Headaches were not a major problem. Besides, it was most likely the stress of getting this action together that caused them. She felt satisfied that they had their planet. Both of the dreamers that she and Billie had talked to had fingered the same system, and Leslie had listed it as the most probable. She walked to the bed, knuckled her tired eyes, and lay down, not bothering to undress. She hadn't even seen Wilks for a while, and wondered if he had gotten the information about the military transport. It would be best to get the go from the powers on Gateway, But if they couldn't, well, there were other ways. She thought about the daydream she had experienced earlier, of Bishop's face surprising her back to reality. She had liked the android, an exception to her negative feelings for synthetics, but his appearance in her mind had seemed wrong, out of place, not of her own memory. Medtechs and artificial humans, the world of science and personal demons. Maybe they were all crazy. Maybe the idea was nothing more than a mad woman's nightmare, and Ripley had stumbled into it. Maybe... Ripley fell asleep.